The knock came just after sundown, when the frost had begun to claim the corners of the windows, and the fire had long since died to embers. Liza's father didn't answer at first. He just stared at the floor, hunched over in the corner with his cap crushed in his hands and mud on his boots from the landlord's field. When the second knock came, louder, slower, like someone giving time to think, Liza knew it wasn't good. Her mother had died 2 winters ago, and the barley hadn't grown right since. Rent was late. The ox had been sold. There was nothing left but the girl who still sang in the mornings and tried to mend what was broken. When her father finally opened the door, 2 men stood in the cold, one holding a folded piece of parchment and the other holding nothing at all, just looking. "It's time," the man with the paper said. "1 month's shelter for the girl." Her father didn't argue. He just stepped aside. Liza looked at him, eyes wide, lips trembling, waiting for something, anything, a reason, a refusal, a lie. But the only thing he said, in a voice dry as hay, was, "Go with them." She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stepped into the frost barefoot in her patchwork dress, with her hands folded in front of her like she'd seen the widows do in church. The men said nothing on the way, not until they reached the cart parked beside the hollow stone cross, and the one without the parchment lifted her in like she was a sack of oats. "You'll serve the squire's house," he said. "Keep your head down, no questions. 1 month." But when the car turned the corner past the chapel, a figure stood in the shadows of the stone archway, a man in a simple hooded robe, silent as the wind. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but his eyes followed the cart as it passed, and Liza felt something stir inside her, a warmth she hadn't felt since her mother's hands last braided her hair. She didn't know it yet, but that monk would change everything. The manor loomed like a judgment carved in stone, all sharp chimneys and shuttered eyes. When the cart stopped, Liza was pulled down without ceremony and marched through the servants' gate, past rows of dried herbs, cracked pots, and a scullery maid who glanced up just long enough to offer pity without words. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke, grease, and damp rot. A house grand in stone, but hollow in soul. "She'll work the kitchens and sweep the hall," said the steward, a lank man with a scar that curved his lip into a permanent sneer. "And if the squire takes an interest, you'll smile and curtsy like you're glad of it." Liza didn't answer. She bowed her head and nodded. That night she scrubbed until her hands blistered and her knees bruised on the cold tile, as she ate crusts and drank broth that tasted of nothing, and she slept on a cot beneath the stairs, where rats rustled behind the wall. But it wasn't the filth that scared her. It was the silence of the house, the kind that waits, watches. On the 3rd day, the squire himself came to supper, and Liza was made to serve. He was younger than she expected, with fine rings and finer hair, but his eyes were colder than the snow falling outside. "What's your name, girl?" he asked as she poured the wine. "Liza," she whispered, not daring to look up. "Liza," he repeated slowly, like tasting something to decide if it pleased him. "You've got fine hands for a farmer's brat." His fingers brushed hers intentionally. She pulled away so fast the jug tipped, spilling red across the white cloth. The steward shouted, a maid gasped. Liza froze, but the squire only laughed and waved a hand. "Let her be," he said. "She'll learn." That night, back under the stairs, Liza cried for the first time, not for herself, but for the quiet that now lived inside her. She had been sold like a goat, touched like property, and still had weeks left to serve. But before sleep took her, she remembered the eyes of the monk by the chapel wall, the way he had watched, the way he had seen. She didn't know his name, but she began to pray, not to God, but to the silence where he had stood, It was the 7th morning when the bell above the manor gate rang, its sharp clang slicing through the stillness of dawn. Liza was kneeling by the hearth, scraping blackened ash from the iron pan, when the steward's voice barked her name. "Front gate! Now!" She wiped her hands and went, heart thudding. Visitors didn't come at this hour unless summoned, or owed something. Outside, the sky was the colour of stone, and the ground crunched beneath her thin shoes. A figure stood just beyond the gate, waiting without moving, wrapped in a rough brown cloak that blended into the winter-barren hedges. It was him, the monk. She knew before she could see his face. The steward unlocked the gate with an irritated grunt. "Begging or blessing?" he asked. The monk said nothing. He simply reached beneath his cloak and pulled out a small leather pouch, coins, real silver. The steward's eyes narrowed. "What's this, then?" The monk extended the pouch. "Payment," he said at last, voice deep and calm, as if every word weighed more than gold. "For the girl." The steward laughed, short and sharp. "She's not for sale. She's under contract. 1 month. The monk met his gaze without blinking. "You'll find there is more here than a month's worth of rent." He dropped the pouch in the steward's hand and turned to leave without another word. But before he vanished past the hedges, he looked directly at Liza and bowed, not a nod, a bow, full and respectful as one might offer a queen. The gate closed. The steward opened the pouch, eyes widening. "Bloody fool," he muttered, "paid 5 times over for a farmer's daughter." That afternoon, Liza was called to the upper chamber, where the steward handed her a bundle of cloth, a loaf of bread, and a small slip of parchment. "He's waiting by the chapel," the steward grumbled. "Says you're free." Liza didn't speak. She just clutched the bundle and walked, numb, past the manor that had swallowed her. When she reached the chapel steps, the monk stood beside a lantern, the wind catching the edge of his robe. "Why?" she asked. He looked at her, then pointed to the chapel's stone wall, where someone had etched a simple line. "No one is forgotten here." And without waiting for thanks, he began to walk. Liza followed. The path to the abbey wound through woods left naked by winter, their branches skeletal and still. But Liza did not shiver. Not because she was warm, but because the monk's presence beside her cast a kind of hush over the world, like snow before it falls. He did not speak as they walked, nor look at her more than necessary, and yet she felt seen with every step. When they reached the stone archway that marked the edge of the abbey lands, he paused and raised a hand. She stopped too. Before them stood a crumbling church cloaked in ivy, its roof sunken in places, its windows long since emptied of glass. But the bell tower remained, and so did its quiet heart. The monk opened the old wooden door and motioned for her to enter. Inside, candlelight flickered along the walls. Not many, just enough to see the tapestries that still clung in faded reds and golds. A table, simple, a hearth, lit, and a single cot made neatly with folded wool. "You may stay here," he said, voice steady. "This is sanctuary." Liza clutched her bundle tighter. "Why me?" she asked for the second time. He didn't answer directly. Instead, he reached into his robe and placed something on the table, a length of twine with a silver thistle charm at the center. "My sister wore this," he said softly. "She was sold too." Liza's breath caught. What happened to her? She never found sanctuary. His eyes met hers then, unflinching, filled with sorrow that had been buried deep and lived long. But I swore if I ever saw it again I would not be silent. Liza touched the charm, fingers trembling. "I don't have anything to repay you." "You owe nothing," he said, "but if you choose to stay, you must live, not hide." That night, Liza lay on the cot and listened to the wind press against the old stone walls. For the first time in weeks, no one barked orders. No one touched her without permission. No one watched her like she was worth less than a sack of flour. And yet she could not sleep. Not from fear, but from the weight of a kindness so great, she feared it might disappear by morning. But when dawn came, the monk was already in the chapel garden, planting seeds in frozen soil. The earth was still hard with frost, but the monk's hands moved as if spring had already come. Liza stood at the edge of the chapel garden, her breath misting in the air, watching him press tiny seeds into the frozen soil. "It won't grow," she said gently. "Not yet." He looked up, a faint smile on his lips. "But it will remember." She didn't know what he meant, but she stepped forward anyway, kneeling beside him in the brittle grass. Together, in silence, they worked. She broke the soil with a stick. He dropped the seeds. It wasn't farming the way her father had taught her. There were no oxen, no shouting, no bloodied hands. Just patience and rhythm and the sound of two people trying to heal without saying so. Inside the chapel, the candles burned low. Outside, the bell above the crumbled tower rang once every hour. Not for sermons, but for the habit of remembering. Days passed like this. Liza swept the stone floors, mended robes with borrowed thread, and once even hummed a tune her mother used to sing. She didn't realize she'd done it until the monk looked up from his reading with a soft surprise in his eyes. "That song," he said, "it's from the northern hills." "My mother sang it when she baked," Liza replied, "even when there wasn't enough to eat." The monk nodded and said nothing more. But the next morning, there was bread on the table, thick with rosemary, still warm from the hearth. "Did you bake this?" she asked. He shrugged, but there was flour on his sleeve. She laughed. It caught both of them off guard. He looked at her, startled at first, and then relieved, as if her laughter had been the final proof that she truly existed, that she hadn't vanished in the silence of that manor, that she hadn't been broken. On the 7th day, she asked his name. "Benedict," he said simply. "It means blessed." She considered that. "Then I must call myself Found," she said, voice steady. He smiled. "Then we are both named true." That night, as the wind howled beyond the chapel walls, Liza slept with her hand wrapped around the thistle charm, and for the first time in years, her dreams were not of escape, but of a garden where everything broken had a place to grow. It was nearly dusk when the knock came again. 2 quick raps, then a pause, then one more. Not the quiet knock of a beggar or the heavy fist of a landlord. It was a pattern, intentional. Liza was gathering firewood near the chapel gate when she heard it, and the hairs on her neck stood up like bristles on a frightened cat. Benedict appeared in the doorway, his robe dusted with ash, his expression unreadable. He gave her a look that said, "Stay." But she didn't. She crept closer, silent behind the ivy, just enough to see the man who stood at the threshold. He was tall, with boots too fine for the mud, and a coat stitched in red thread. Noble house markings. A lord's man, or worse, the squire's. "We were told a girl was brought here," the man said, voice tight with false politeness. "Farmer's daughter, contracted to the manor, she's missing." Benedict said nothing. The man tried again. "We'll pay for return, or take her back without fuss. No need for trouble." Still, Benedict didn't speak. Instead, he reached into his robe and retrieved the parchment the steward had signed, the slip Liza had been given on her release. He handed it over. The man examined it, lip curling. "This proves payment, not permission." Benedict finally spoke. "She was not property. She was collateral," the man snapped, "and now she's an embarrassment to someone important." Liza's heart thudded. She knew what that meant. The squire hadn't forgotten, and worse, he hadn't let go. The man stepped forward. Return her, or they'll come with more than ink and questions. Benedict looked past him to the woods beyond, then back. She is not here as a servant, he said. She is here as a soul. With that, he closed the chapel door, firm, final. The man didn't knock again, just mounted his horse and rode into the darkness. Liza stood still long after the hoofbeats faded. When she finally stepped into the light of the chapel, Benedict was already back at the hearth. They'll come again, she said. He nodded. Let them. You're not afraid. I've lived long with fear, he said, but I no longer kneel to it. And neither in that moment did she. The silence they shared was not cowardice. It was defiance carved in stone. They came at sunrise, cloaked in mist and arrogance. 3 riders in black, their horses restless, their coats bearing the silver crest of Lord Elborn, the squire's family name. Liza saw them before they reached the chapel gate. She stood in the bell tower, her hands dusted with flour, watching the way the fog parted around them like they belonged to another world. One of cold halls, heavy rules and punishments wrapped in ribbons. She went to Benedict. They're here. He only nodded and stood as if he'd been expecting this exact hour. The riders dismounted without a word and entered the chapel yard like it was theirs by birthright. The one in front, clean-shaven, sharp-eyed, stepped forward with a scroll and the air of someone used to winning. You house a thief, he said, a girl who breached contract and slandered her betters. Benedict didn't answer. The man held up the scroll. Lord Elborn demands her return, or the land this chapel stands on will be seized under parish law. You have until sundown. Liza stepped forward before she realized she was moving. I didn't slander anyone, she said, voice low. But if I had, I'd still sleep easier than he does. The man narrowed his eyes. You dare speak against nobility? I dare speak, she replied. That's all it takes, isn't it? The man looked to Benedict. You shelter rebellion. Benedict's voice was calm. I shelter truth. With a scoff, the rider handed him the scroll and turned. You've been warned. When we return, we won't bring ink. They rode off, hooves tearing at the frostbitten earth. The silence afterward felt heavier than any threat. Liza turned to Benedict. He means it. They'll burn it down. Let them try, Benedict replied, unshaken, but they will not find what they seek here. You'd lose all this for me? This place is not stone and timber, he said. It is a vow, and vows once given cannot be bought back. That night, Liza didn't sleep. She watched the flames in the hearth, watched Benedict meditate by the candlelight, and realized something terrifying and beautiful all at once. She wasn't just being protected anymore. She was being taught to stand. And the next time they came, she swore she would not stand behind him, but beside him. They came at midnight with torches instead of scrolls, no crests, no announcements, just fire and fury. Liza heard the crackle before she saw the light, red and violent, licking the edge of the outer garden wall. She ran to the chapel yard, Benedict already there, cloaked and still, staring down a line of shadowed men who had not come to speak. The same steward from the manor stood in front, torch in hand, hatred etched into the folds of his face. She was bought like meat, he spat. Now you dress her like a priest's sister and think it makes her sacred. It was not a purchase, Benedict replied. It was mercy. The steward hurled the torch against the chapel wall. Flames climbed the old stone like vines. Liza gasped, but Benedict did not move. He raised a hand, not in fear, but in calm. You've already taken her home, her name, her voice. You will not take her sanctuary. One of the men hesitated, shifting nervously. We were told this would be quiet, he muttered, not burning down God's house. She's a servant who forgot her place, the steward barked. And he's a monk who forgets who owns this land. No one owns what is freely given, Benedict said, and she was given back to herself. The steward turned to the others. Torch it all! But not one moved. The flames on the wall had begun to die down, doused by the damp stone. The fire hadn't caught, only blackened. The steward reached for a second torch, but a voice rang out behind them. That's enough! A woman emerged from the trees, grey cloak, worn boots, a villager. Behind her came more, men and women, farmers and shepherds, even the baker's boy from the village. Dozens, silent, watching. One stepped forward. We heard the bell ring in the wrong hour. That only happens in danger. Another, this chapel's blessed my fields 3 years straight. I won't watch it burn. One by one, they stepped between the torches and the chapel, forming a human wall. The steward paled. You'll all be fined, punished. Let them try, said the grey-cloaked woman. We've already lived through worse. And in that moment, Liza saw it. This wasn't just about her. The silent monk hadn't saved one girl. He'd rekindled a villager's courage, a fire that could not be extinguished. By morning, the ashes had cooled, but something else had begun to burn. Quietly, steadily, in every villager who had stood in the line. The squire's men never returned that night. Perhaps they'd seen the torches dim and thought the chapel was ruined. Or perhaps they'd seen the people and realized no law could touch what had taken root. Liza stood beneath the bell tower, her hands folded, her dress singed at the hem, watching as Benedict carefully rewrote the names in the old chapel ledger. The last few pages had been left blank for years. There hasn't been a new name in a long time, he said, glancing up at her. Would you like to write yours? Liza hesitated. She had no surname anymore, no claim to land, only scars and stories. But then she remembered what he had told her, that this place wasn't stone and timber, but a vow. She took the quill. Slowly, carefully, she wrote, Liza of the chapel. Benedict smiled. It suits you. I've never belonged anywhere, she said, not even in my own home. You do now. Words spread fast through the county. People came, not just from the village, but from farther. Women fleeing forced marriages, children who'd been beaten for disobedience, old men whose land had been taken with ink and threats. They didn't come to pray. They came to stand, to clean, to fix what the fire had scorched, and to add their names to the back of the ledger. By the week's end, there were 12 new names. By the month's end, there were 40. The chapel garden bloomed early that spring, as if the soil had known the roots needed it more than the sun did. One morning, as Liza hung linen from the bell tower beams, a rider approached, but this time he bore no crest, no scroll, only a small basket left at the chapel gate. Inside were fresh rolls, a single silver coin, and a note. I was once like her. Thank you for reminding me I wasn't worthless. It was unsigned. Liza didn't need to know the name. What mattered was that someone had seen her, not just in pain, but in purpose. She wasn't a farmer's daughter anymore. She was Liza of the chapel, and that meant something. The seasons turned gently after that, not because hardship vanished, but because it was no longer shouldered alone. The chapel, once cracked and crumbling, now stood proud with its roof thatched by many hands and its pews repaired with mismatched wood that carried a strange kind of beauty, one born of survival. The garden grew stronger than ever, even in the shallow soil, and every plant was marked with a name, not the name of the seed, but of the person who had planted it. Liza's was a row of lavender, Benedict's rosemary. By midsummer, a visitor came who said nothing at all. A young girl, no older than 12, with torn shoes and a stitched lip. She wandered into the chapel while Liza was sweeping. Their eyes met. The girl froze. Liza knelt down, held out her hand. "You're safe now," she said. No questions, no judgments, only shelter. That evening, Liza sat beside Benedict beneath the bell tower as the sun painted the sky in violet and flame. "She won't speak," she said softly. "She may never," Benedict replied, "but her silence is her own now, not someone else's punishment." Liza nodded, then smiled. "Do you think I was meant to come here?" "I think you were meant to survive, and you did the rest yourself. Would your sister have liked this place?" she asked. Benedict looked to the sky. "I think she's already here." The bell above them rang once, wind catching its old chain, not a warning, not a summons, just a sound, a reminder that this place was alive, that it had chosen to remain. That night, the girls slept in Liza's old cot beneath the stairs. Liza left a piece of bread and the thistle charm beside her pillow, not to give it away, but to pass it on. A vow made not once, but again and again, through every girl who arrived barefoot and afraid, and left with a name she chose for herself. In time, they stopped calling it the Old Chapel. It became simply the Haven, a place where the wind could knock, but never enter, where pain was remembered, but never in vain, and where, if you listened closely at dawn, you could hear the sound of seeds pushing up through the soil, whispering, "You are not forgotten."